Economics in Action, a podcast where we explore topics and ideas related to economics. In this episode, we'll be examining labor unions through the lens of the recent SAG AFTRA labor strike. When most people think of labor unions, it's often with a sense of solidarity. It's the little guys sticking it to the big corporate overlords. We'll examine whether this view is accurate and how to think about the role of labor unions in society. We'll also answer some basic questions, such as why do labor unions exist, as well as who do they benefit, who do they harm, and what are the trade-offs. But first, let's look at our case study, the SAG AFTRA labor strikes. SAG AFTRA is like this superhero union for folks in the entertainment world. Think actors, singers, news anchors, and even puppeteers. It's a mashup of two older unions, the Screen Actors Guild, that's the SAG part, and the American Federation of Television and Radio Arts, that's the AFTRA part. SAG popped up in 1933 because Hollywood actors were tired of super long hours and not so great pay. AFTRA came around in 1937, focusing on TV and the radio crowd. Fast forward to 2012, and the two decided to join forces, creating SAG AFTRA. Like any group looking out for its members, they've had their fair share of showdowns with the big studios and producers. In 1980, SAG had a big strike about getting more money from TV and film reruns, and then in 2000, there was a massive 6-month strike about commercials. With cable TV blowing up, actors wanted to make sure they got their fair cut. The latest strike began on July 14th and is aimed at members getting higher pay, a percentage of streaming revenue, and most interestingly, protections against the use of AI in films and movies. Also interesting is that just like the trade union that represents actors and other artists, movie and television producers have their own trade association called the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. This is the organization that enters into collective bargaining agreements with SAG AFTRA workers and represents major motion picture studios like Paramount, Sony, and Walt Disney, major broadcast TV networks like NBC, ABC, CBS, and Fox, and also streaming services like Netflix, Apple, and Amazon. However, there are many independent production companies that aren't affiliated with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers and have been allowed to continue to film. You might be thinking, if all these Hollywood actors are so angry at the studios, why don't they just pool their savings and start their own studio? As an interesting historical artifact, this actually did happen. In 1919, 4 of the biggest names in the film industry, most notably Charlie Chaplin, came together to form United Artists. Their primary motivation was frustration with the growing power of the major studios, which often exerted significant control over their work and reaped most of the financial rewards. These 4 industry titans envisioned a company where artists could have more control over their films, from production to distribution, ensuring both creative freedom and a larger share of the profits. At its core, UA's business model was a departure from the traditional studio system. Instead of producing films in-house with contracted talent, UA primarily focused as a distributor for independent producers. While the model had its advantages, it also posed challenges. UA's success was tied to the quality and commercial appeal of the films it distributed. Without a consistent in-house production pipeline, the company faced periods of financial instability, especially if a series of films underperformed. Additionally, UA had to continuously attract top talent and quality films to retain competitiveness, which is not always guaranteed. So what ended up happening with United Artists? Well, after some financial difficulties in the 50s and 60s, it was eventually bought out by Transamerica Corporation in the late 1960s, and then sold again to MGM Studios in 1981. It's still around today, but in a much lesser form. Okay, now back to labor unions. Why do they even exist? Well, the best answer is that labor unions exist to address the inherent power imbalance between individual workers and their employers, and to collectively advocate for better wages, working conditions, and other employment rights. In economic history, there has been sympathy for this view. Even Adam Smith, the father of the invisible hand in free markets, had this to say: "What are the common wages of labor depends everywhere upon the contract usually made between those two parties whose interests are by no means the same. The workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. The former are disposed to combine in order to raise, the latter in order to lower the wages of labor. It is not, however, difficult to foresee which of the two parties must, upon all ordinary occasions, have the advantage in the dispute, and force the other into compliance with their terms." While Adam Smith seemed to be at least partially on the side of labor, the neoclassical economic perspective, rooted in theories in the 18th and 19th century, often viewed labor unions with skepticism. Central to this viewpoint was the belief in the self-regulating nature of free markets. Neoclassical thinkers posited that wages, akin to other prices, should naturally be determined by the unimpeded forces of supply and demand. Think back to our last episode on Hayek and the knowledge problem. Local knowledge means that decisions are best made at an individual level. Labor unions, with their collective bargaining practices, were perceived as external interferences that distorted these natural market forces. In this framework, wages are intrinsically linked to labor productivity and the prevailing conditions of the market. If due to union influence, wages were elevated above what was justified by productivity and market dynamics, it was believed this could precipitate unemployment. The rationale is pretty straightforward. At inflated wage levels, employers might be disinclined to hire as extensively, leading to a mismatch between labor supply and demand. Typically, firms will hire additional workers when their marginal revenue product exceeds their wage. In simple terms, that means that companies will figure out how much the next worker can produce and multiply it by the revenue they receive from selling those extra units. If that's greater or equal to the wage, they'll be hired. This makes sense intuitively. Think about a firm who hires an additional worker who can produce 10 widgets an hour, and the widgets sell for $2 each. The marginal revenue product of this worker is $20. If the wage paid to workers at this company was $30, it wouldn't make sense to hire this worker. The company would be losing money on all of those additional units produced. This is similar to the situation where wages are pushed up due to union bargaining. Those workers that are less productive or make the firm less revenue won't be hired. Furthermore, neoclassical economists harbored concerns about the monopolistic tendencies of labor unions. Just as they critiqued monopolies in the traditional markets for their potential to skew prices and reduce efficiency, they viewed labor unions as monopolistic entities in the labor market, capable of distorting both wages and employment levels. We'll come back to this point later. Lastly, the classical economic doctrine placed significant emphasis on individual labor contracts. Such contracts, they argued, offered the requisite flexibility and were more attuned to the specific skills, productivity, and preferences of individual workers. In contrast, collective bargaining was perceived as a more rigid mechanism, potentially less responsive to the diverse needs of the workforce. For example, some SAG AFTRA workers might care a lot about the residuals they make, but not care as much about the base pay if they've been working for a while and are always paid more than just the base. While the classical viewpoint offers a foundational lens through which to understand labor unions, it's worth noting that newer economic theories and research have painted a more nuanced picture. So let's talk about some of the criticisms of the standard theory. First, labor markets are seen to have various frictions that undermine the perfectly competitive nature of the labor market that is assumed by the classical viewpoint. For example, the principle of perfect information is assumed in the Standard Model. In this idealized competitive market, every worker knows both their marginal revenue product and the wage rates offered across all potential employers. Simultaneously, firms are also aware of the exact productivity of each worker. In reality, informational asymmetries are pervasive. Many workers might not fully understand their worth in the market, and firms can capitalize on this lack of knowledge. Today, while platforms like Glassdoor and LinkedIn provide more transparency around salaries and roles, complete information is still a far way away. Second is the idea of mobility without cost, and is another simplifying assumption that the classical view makes. The idea here is that if workers are priced out of the market in some area because wages are too low, they can just get up and move to another area where wages are higher for their particular set of skills and experience. In the real world, however, transitioning between jobs comes with various costs. Some of these are monetary, like potential relocation expenses or training costs, and others are non-monetary, such as the emotional and psychological strain of adapting to a new work environment or severing social ties from a previous job. Furthermore, some economists think that the dominance of only a few large employers in many markets represents a unique form of market failure called monopsony. This is a situation where there is only one dominant buyer, typically referring to a single employer in the labor market. This contrasts with a monopoly, where there is one dominant seller. In the context of a labor market, when a monopsonistic employer is the primary or sole source of jobs in a particular area or industry, it gains disproportionate power over determining wage rates. Without the pressure of competing employers vying for the same talent, the monopsonistic employer can offer wages that are lower than would be expected in a competitive market. The lack of alternatives forces workers to accept these reduced wages as they have limited or no other employment opportunities available. Consequently, monopsonies can suppress wages below the level that would reflect the true value of the labor, leading to economic inefficiencies in the distribution of income. Lastly, some economists point out the fact that real-world labor markets often feature factors like discrimination, which can profoundly influence wage setting beyond just productivity. Social norms and biases can have a big impact on hiring decisions and are difficult to measure. So the thinking goes, even in markets that seem competitive, these and other complexities, in particular the social and cultural aspects that influence transactions in the labor markets, can lead to economic inefficiencies. So which camp is right? Well, it's complicated, but I think that a fictional example might be helpful to elucidate who is affected and in what ways from labor union participation. Let's imagine a young woman who has just moved out to LA to make a living as an actress. She applies for every position she can find to build up her resume and can do so freely as long as it's a non-union job. Many commercials and made-for-TV movies are done outside of union control, and as a new entrant to the field, she might be willing to take a lower-paying job in order to build up her reel. This is certainly a benefit to the production companies because they might not have to pay her overtime, insurance, or residuals. But she also might be happy with this arrangement because she gets experience that she wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And there is an important point to be made here. It might seem like she's competing with the production company for higher pay, but she's actually competing with other actresses who also want the role. If they're more talented than her, have more experience, or know more people, one of the only chances she has is to be willing to take lower pay for her services. Furthermore, she would have liked to compete based on pay for some of the latest TV streaming roles or in the newest movies, but unfortunately she's unable to. That's unless she joins the SAG AFTRA union. Eligible once you have worked at least 3 SAG AFTRA background roles or 1 speaking role, and after paying the $3,000 membership fee and semi-yearly dues. This is not as easy as it sounds though, as union productions typically must hire union actors. If they hire non-union actors, then the casting director needs to argue why it is better to hire a non-union actor for this part over a union member. Getting hired for a speaking role in a union production is known as being Taft-Hartley'd. This comes from the 1947 Labor Management Relations Act that was passed to restrict the power of labor unions in unfair labor practices. This was a groundbreaking law, and it's important in the acting world because it allows producers to hire outside of the union labor pool. This is an incredibly rare path to take though, and most members get in the other way, which is to get 3 vouchers for being a background actor in union productions. However, neither of these paths are easy, and many say that it can take years and even sometimes decades to get union membership. However, once she's in, she's set, right? She will get a lot more benefits and much higher pay for the work she does. Well, it's not all smooth sailing. Being a new actress, she's now competing with all of the other more qualified actresses. A much more competitive pool, and one in which salary, by being capped, means that she'll have to compete in other ways. Furthermore, she's now excluded from taking any of those non-union commercials or other gigs that she might have wanted to take otherwise. So while union membership is good for those who've been in a while, gained experience, and made it through the gauntlet, as it were, it's not as great as it may seem for this woman in our example. I use this example to point out the complexities of the labor market. Labor unions can be great for many, but for some, they're not as ideal as they might sound. In conclusion, labor unions have historically played a pivotal role in shaping the dynamics of the workforce. On the positive side, they have been instrumental in advocating for improved wages, enhanced working conditions, and more reasonable hours. Their collective bargaining power has led to the establishment of many labor rights and benefits that are now standard in many industries. By representing a collective body of workers, unions ensure that the interests of employees are not overshadowed by the overarching objectives of large corporations, and they may even increase economic efficiency in markets where there is one dominant purchaser of labor. Many researchers also point out that declines in real wages and widening inequality over the past 40 years have coincided with the decline of union participation. On the other hand, there are also criticisms associated with labor unions. Many economists argue that they can introduce inefficiencies into the workplace, particularly when union regulations make it challenging to address issues of employee performance or adapt to changing economic conditions. By negotiating higher wages, unions can sometimes push wages above the market clearing level. If wages are set too high, it can lead to reduced hiring or even layoffs, as employers might find it too costly to employ as many workers at the elevated wage rate. Furthermore, unionized workers, or insiders, might enjoy better wages and job security, but this can sometimes come at the expense of non-unionized workers, or outsiders. It can be limiting for some, especially new entrants to the job market, who would be willing to compete on pay rather than talent or skill. Thus, while labor unions have their merits, they also come with associated downsides that should be considered. Thanks for listening. If you like this podcast, please subscribe to be updated on the latest episodes, or leave a comment sharing what you like about the show.